It all began with a pizza. Not just any pizza, an extra-large pie with everything on it, piled high with greasy, gooey cheese, pepperoni, and the most suspicious-looking mushrooms Evan had ever seen. As a physicist, he knew better than to trust anything labeled experimental, but the mushrooms had been free. What could possibly go wrong? He sat in his lab, half-heartedly chewing as he stared at the array of wires and glowing blue lights around him. His eyes were heavy, and he wasn't sure if it was the pizza or the fact that he had been working non-stop for the last 36 hours, trying to crack the code of antimatter. "Come on, Evan," he muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes. One breakthrough. Just one. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he punched in the final sequence of equations, adjusting the output for his latest experiment. The device, a collection of magnets and sensors shaped like an oversized toaster, hummed to life. There was a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made his chair shake slightly. He adjusted his glasses, looking at the readout in front of him. His pulse quickened as he saw the numbers align perfectly. He had done it. He'd cracked it. Eureka! Evan yelled, startling the cat that had been sleeping next to the pile of textbooks. He glanced around, expecting someone to congratulate him, Nina, maybe, his best friend and occasionally his lab partner, but he was alone. And that's when the device exploded. The blast wasn't huge, but it was enough to send Evan tumbling across the room. His head hit the floor hard, and for a moment, everything went black. When he came to, there was no sign of the explosion, no wreckage, no lingering smell of burnt pizza. Everything was calm. Too calm. Evan slowly stood up, rubbing his skull. His body felt heavy, sluggish, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked just a little too hard. What the hell? He muttered. He looked at his hands, noticing something strange. They were translucent. Not in the way that sunlight through fog makes things look ethereal, but in the way things look when they're too far away to touch. Okay, he said, shaking his head. I need to stop napping in the middle of experiments. He reached for his phone, his fingers grazing the smooth surface. Something was wrong, though. He didn't quite make contact with it. His fingers passed through the device like a ghost. Panicked, he looked at his hands again. Am I dead? His voice cracked as he spoke, and he shuddered. He felt alive, but his body was wrong. His skin was losing its texture, like it was fading, becoming lighter and more fragile. The bones felt like they were no longer connected, each one floating in some impossible dimension. No. This is bad. Really bad, he mumbled. Evan scrambled for the nearest mirror and took one look at his reflection. What he saw nearly sent him into full-blown hysterics. His face was there, sort of. It looked faded, like an unfinished painting that had been left out in the rain. His eyes were the only part of him still completely intact, wide with disbelief. Okay, calm down, he told himself. Maybe I just need to sleep this off. Or maybe I can just. The moment he tried to move, his body stumbled like it was made of rubber, uncoordinated, as if his mind wasn't quite connecting with his limbs. He slammed into the wall, only to feel it pass right through his form. He gasped, stumbling backwards. His reflection, his soul, was flickering like an old television set with poor reception. No. This isn't happening, he repeated, stumbling away from the mirror. He backed into a chair, but it didn't stop him. He just kept going, phasing right through it like it was smoke. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if he was having a stroke, but something was wrong. Something very, very wrong. And that's when the true horror of the situation set in. He wasn't just fading from the world. His soul, what was left of it, was separating from his body. In sheer panic, Evan grabbed his phone again, trying to call Nina. His fingers passed through it like it wasn't even there. He could feel the vibrations from the phone, but there was no contact, no reality, just the hollow sensation of being untethered from everything. Evan collapsed onto the floor, clutching at his chest, feeling the emptiness inside him expanding. Something was pulling at him, his body, his soul, his very sense of existence was splitting apart. A deep coldness spread through him, far colder than anything he'd ever felt before. And yet, it wasn't just a physical cold, it was a metaphysical chill, a complete and utter detachment from the world. "I'm losing myself," he whispered, the words trembling in the air. "I'm becoming nothing." For the first time, Evan felt small. So small that he could barely recognize his own presence in the universe. He wasn't sure if he was still real anymore. Was he even alive? Or was he just some quantum anomaly, a glitch in the fabric of reality? The thought made him dizzy, and he quickly tried to shake it off. He stood up again, this time with more resolve. He needed answers. There had to be something he could do, something that could stop this horrific transformation before it became permanent. His first instinct was to check the lab's computer. Maybe there was something he could salvage from the failed experiment. Perhaps there was a solution, something he missed in the chaos of his excitement. He staggered over to the desk and, with great difficulty, typed in a string of commands. His fingers barely touched the keyboard, the keys slipping through his translucent hand. But somehow, he managed to pull up the data. That's when he saw it.in the margins of his research notes. There was a fragment of a passage that Dr. Caleb Drayton, one of the leading experts in antimatter, had once written. "When the antimatter essence is separated from the physical body, the soul becomes free. However, it is unstable. To regain balance, the subject must reassemble their form before the antimatter destroys their very existence. Without the right tools, the process is irreversible." Evan's heart skipped a beat. Irreversible? Drayton had disappeared years ago after conducting similar experiments. No one knew what had happened to him. The last known record was his last journal entry, which was strangely incomplete, except for that warning. But now, Evan knew what had happened. Drayton had done what Evan had accidentally done, separated his soul from his body using antimatter, and now Evan was facing the same fate. His eyes widened as a thought formed in his mind. He had to find Drayton's notes, his final research, if he had any hope of saving himself. That was the only way out. There had to be a way to reverse the process, to reintegrate his soul with his body before the antimatter consumed him completely. But first, he needed to find Drayton. And to do that, he would have to step out into the world with a body that wasn't quite a body and a soul that wasn't quite a soul. "I have to fix this," Evan whispered to the empty lab, his voice breaking through the silence. "I have to fix myself." And with that, Evan began the strange journey to find the answers that would restore him, or at least, stop him from vanishing entirely. But in this state, he wasn't sure which was scarier, the search for a solution or the terrifying idea that he might never find one. Evan didn't waste another second in his lab. His body, if it could still be called that, seemed to flicker with every movement. He struggled with each step, aware that his soul was slipping further and further from his physical form. His feet felt light, like they were no longer quite grounded in reality, and the room around him seemed to stretch and contract, like the walls were breathing. Every breath he took felt distant, as though it were someone else's, but he had no choice. The only thing that could save him was the Chronos Nexus, Drayton's last creation, buried deep within the labyrinthine halls of a forgotten research facility. If Evan was going to escape this bizarre fate, he would have to find it. He wasn't sure how he was going to make it there in this state, but the alternative was worse, becoming nothing, disappearing into pure antimatter, the very essence of emptiness. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, but his hand passed right through the fabric. He tried again, more forcefully this time, but only managed to leave a ripple in the fabric, like something out of a bad dream. Desperation made him angry, and for the first time, he let his frustration bubble over. "What the hell am I supposed to do?" he shouted, his voice echoing oddly in the space, as though it weren't entirely real. The sound was distorted, muffled, as though he were talking underwater. He slammed his hand down on the desk, but his palm went straight through the surface. "I can't even grab my own jacket," he muttered bitterly. A new thought crossed his mind, Nina. She would be able to help. At least, she had always been there for him in the past. Nina had a sharp mind and a cool head, and even though she might freak out at first, she would listen. He needed to talk to her, tell her what was happening, and maybe, just maybe, she could help him figure out what to do. Evan reached for his phone again. His fingers brushed over the screen, and for a brief moment, he felt a connection. His reflection in the phone was still distorted, but there it was, a semblance of normalcy. He tapped in Nina's number with more force than necessary, praying that she'd pick up. The phone rang, but after a few seconds, her voicemail picked up. "Nina, it's me, it's Evan. Something's wrong, really wrong. I'm not sure how to explain this, but I need you to come to the lab. Please, hurry." Evan stared at the phone for a moment, feeling a rising sense of helplessness. He could still feel the faintest traces of his body, but with each passing second, it seemed further out of reach, like trying to grab a cloud. He closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the task at hand. The lab was near the edge of town, so Nina would probably take about 20 minutes to arrive. He would have to make do in the meantime. He thought about Drayton's journal again, the cryptic references to the Chronos Nexus. According to the notes, the Nexus wasn't just a device for manipulating time, it was a way to manipulate the very nature of existence. It had the potential to reverse what Evan was going through, if he could get it working before his soul completely dissipated. The problem was, the journal didn't provide clear instructions on how to operate the machine. Everything was fragmented, scattered across pages of hurried writing, as if Drayton had tried to perfect it right up until the moment of his disappearance. Evan exhaled sharply. He couldn't waste time waiting for Nina. He needed to act, and fast. The walk to the research facility felt like it took hours, though he knew it should only take about 15 minutes. Every step felt disconnected from his mind. He walked through streets that were familiar to him, yet now they seemed like strangers, flickering, shifting, never quite solid. At one point, he looked down and saw his feet stepping on a crack in the sidewalk, but the crack seemed to widen and close with each step, an optical illusion that made his head spin. "Focus, Evan," he whispered to himself. "Just keep going." He turned a corner, passing by a row of old shops. One of the signs in a storefront seemed to stretch out of place, out of reality, and for a second, he thought he saw an alternate version of himself reflected in the glass. The Evan who still had his body. The Evan who had never made this terrible mistake. He blinked, and the image vanished. His heart raced. Was it possible? Was he becoming like Drayton? Was he caught in some kind of temporal loop, trapped in an alternate version of his own reality? He shoved the thought out of his mind, not allowing himself to spiral further. There was too much at stake. By the time he reached the facility, the sun had begun to set. The facility itself was a tall, looming structure on the outskirts of town. Most of the windows were boarded up, and a rusted metal door stood at the entrance, a faded sign above it reading, "Private Research Facility, No Admittance." Evan's heart pounded as he approached the entrance, and for a moment, he wondered if he had any right to be here. After all, this was Drayton's place, the place where the mysterious physicist had vanished without a trace. He reached out to touch the door, and as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a sharp jolt of energy ran through him. The sensation was so powerful, it sent him stumbling backward, knocking into a dumpster that was left carelessly on the side. He blinked in confusion, his breath coming in short gasps. What the hell? He tried again, this time focusing all his attention on the door. The metal was cold, and the force of the antimatter separating from his body seemed to react to it. His body, what was left of it, felt a strange, vibrating pull, and for the briefest of moments, he felt a full connection. He could touch something real. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With a deep breath, he shoved the door open. It creaked loudly, and the sound echoed through the empty building. Inside, there were rows upon rows of dusty equipment, familiar devices that he had only ever read about in textbooks. In the far corner, a shadowy figure caught his eye. The figure was slumped against the wall, motionless. For a split second, Evan's heart skipped a beat. Could it be Drayton? Was he still alive? Evan hesitated, the air thick with uncertainty. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't afford to let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. He needed to find the Chronos Nexus. He moved forward, scanning the room for any sign of the machine. His steps were slow, and every inch of him felt like it was slipping further out of sync with reality. The place smelled of mildew and old paper, the air thick with neglect. He reached a desk in the center of the room, and there, sitting under a sheet of yellowing paper, was a large, intricately designed device. It looked like a collection of rotating metal spheres, interwoven with copper wires, and studded with blinking red lights. The Chronos Nexus. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that somehow, this device held the key to restoring his existence. He carefully approached the machine, his movements slow and deliberate. He had no idea how it worked, but desperation pushed him forward. He ran his fingers over the smooth metal, feeling the faint pulse of energy emanating from the machine. It was alive. It was waiting for him to make the first move. He took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he reached for one of the buttons, and then, a voice echoed through the room. Evan. Evan froze, his hand hovering just above the machine. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't Nina's. It was Drayton's. Evan froze, his hand suspended just above the Chronos Nexus, the soft hum of the machine filling the empty space around him. The voice, calm, yet deeply unsettling, echoed through the dark, abandoned facility. It wasn't Nina. It wasn't even a voice he'd ever expected to hear again. But there it was, unmistakably, Evan, his breath hitched, his pulse quickening. He couldn't move. The words had a strange pull, as if they were somehow tethered to his very soul, dragging him closer to something he wasn't ready to face. Drayton? Evan whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking in the silence. The figure slumped in the corner shifted slightly. Evan's heart skipped a beat. The man didn't move much, just the barest twitch, enough to confirm that it was, indeed, Drayton. But this wasn't the man Evan had imagined, the brilliant physicist whose theories had once inspired him. This was something else, something wrong. The man, if that's what he still was, looked like a shadow of his former self. His clothes were tattered and worn, and his skin was pale, almost translucent, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, however, were wide and gleaming, almost unnaturally bright, and they locked onto Evan's with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Evan, Drayton said again, his voice raspy, as though it hadn't been used in years. You shouldn't have come. Evan's breath caught in his throat. I didn't know if you were still alive. What happened to you? Where have you been? How? Drayton chuckled softly, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the cold, empty room. Alive? I don't know if that's the word for it anymore. Evan's stomach twisted, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. Drayton was supposed to have vanished years ago, his work unfinished, his last known project the very thing that had now trapped Evan in this strange existence. And yet here he was, alive, or something close to it, sitting in the corner of the room like a ghost, speaking to him with that same eerie calm. Evan took a cautious step forward, his body still light, unsteady. What's happening to me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Is this what happened to you? I'm losing myself, Drayton. I'm disappearing. Drayton's eyes flickered with what might have been recognition, or perhaps pity. You're not disappearing, Evan. You're transforming. The process has already begun. But you're not the first. And you won't be the last. Evan's mind spun. His soul was already slipping away, and Drayton was talking about transformations and processes like it was all part of some grand plan. Was that why the Chronos Nexus had been left behind? Was it supposed to help fix something like this? Please, Evan said, desperation creeping into his voice. How do I fix this? I can't keep. He waved his hand in front of his face, watching as his fingers flickered in and out of existence. I can't stay like this. I'm losing everything. Drayton's gaze softened slightly, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made Evan uneasy. You think you can fix it? He asked, his tone more amused than sympathetic. Do you even know what you're asking for? Evan took a deep breath, fighting the urge to let his panic overwhelm him. He couldn't afford to lose control. The Nexus. I need to use it. It's supposed to stop. Drayton raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. Don't touch it. Evan's hand hovered over the Chronos Nexus, confused and frustrated. What do you mean, don't touch it? This is the only way, Drayton laughed, the sound bitter. You think this device is going to save you? The Nexus is not a tool, Evan. It's a weapon. A way to rewrite time, to force reality to bend to your will. But there's a cost. Evan frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. A cost? What do you mean? What kind of cost? Drayton looked up at him, his expression weary, almost regretful. You'll never be the same again. Even if you manage to reintegrate your soul with your body, you'll be changed. The Nexus alters more than just time. It changes your very essence. It makes you something else. Evan felt a shiver run down his spine. I don't care about any of that. I don't care what happens to me as long as I can fix this. I don't want to disappear, Drayton. I need to go back. I need to be whole again. Drayton's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something resembling pity in his gaze. You think you can just turn back the clock? It doesn't work like that, Evan. You're dealing with forces you don't understand. Forces that no one understands. Evan clenched his fists in frustration. Then teach me. You've been through this, you've done it, what happened to you? Why are you here? Why didn't you fix it? Drayton's eyes darkened, the light in them flickering like a candle that had nearly gone out. He turned his gaze away, staring at the Chronos Nexus as though it were a long-lost memory. Because I couldn't, Evan. I tried. I really did. But the Nexus, it doesn't just fix things. It takes everything. And it leaves you with nothing but the echo of your past, the shadow of what you once were. Evan took a step back, his mind reeling. What does that mean? What does the Nexus do to you? Drayton turned to face him again, his expression unreadable. It gives you what you want, but it takes away what you need. It bends time and space to your will, but it can never undo the damage already done. You'll never be the same. And neither will anyone else you touch. Evan's heart sank, his stomach churning with dread. So I'm just supposed to accept this? I just let go and fade into nothing? You don't have a choice. Drayton's voice was low, almost apologetic. Not anymore. The Nexus can't undo the damage, but it can delay it. It can give you more time, more moments. But there's a price, Evan. That price is the essence of your soul. You can't have it both ways. Evan's mind raced as Drayton's words settled into him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped would fix this was slipping away. He wanted to scream, to fight, to push back against the gravity of his fate, but all of it felt useless. In that moment, with Drayton standing there, as much a part of the broken facility as the dust and decay surrounding them, Evan realized something else. The Nexus wasn't just a way to fix his problem, it was the reason this problem existed in the first place. It was the thing that had pulled him out of his life and into this fractured existence. And if he was going to make it out, he would have to do more than simply push a button. He would have to choose whether to live with the cost of eternity or let everything slip away. Evan turned toward the Nexus. The machine hummed, waiting for him to make a decision, and as he reached for the button again, he realized that no matter what happened next, there would be no turning back.